Yeah, absolutely. DeepRoots, as you guys know, is a kind of deep dive into best practices for brand expansion. We've talked to a lot of brands over the last 6-8 months, but today's episode, we have a different perspective. We have a perspective of an MSO that does partner with brands, and I'd love to welcome Jaime Mendola, who is the Chief Business Development Officer and Head of Wholesale for AYR Wellness. Jaime, come on in and join the webinar.
Right, here we are. Good to see you, Erik.
Good to see you. Look, I think everyone knows who AYR is, but you know, I think that status quo of where are you today and your expansion strategies, and give everyone just kind of a quick elevator pitch on AYR and your progress in legalized states.
Sure. AYR is a publicly traded MSO. We're currently operational in 7 markets: Massachusetts, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, Illinois, and Nevada. And we're currently in process of standing up a vertical operation in partnership with a social equity partner in Connecticut. So that's probably more of a 2024 story. We're currently vertical in all of those markets with the exception of Illinois, where we are only have retail. We have reasonably large footprints in each of those markets. So we've stayed focused on markets that we felt like had attractive supply-demand dynamics and where we had the potential to build some scale, to be one of the top 5 players in each of those respective markets. And we're there in most, not all, but we're getting there.
So vertically integrated in almost all the markets with the exception of Illinois. And that's probably been the path forward. Every time you applied for the license, you became vertically integrated. How did that shape your overall thesis on who to partner with? Obviously, in the beginning, you're getting flour on the shelves of your own flour that you grow and whatnot. What was the philosophy of how to partner with brands, and how did that thesis evolve?
Sure. So look, our business has been built through a combination of new market applications as well as acquisitions, like many of the MSOs. It's probably been about 3/4 acquisition of single state operators, and the balance being markets that we've stood up ourselves and built. I think really the vertical integration was a lot more necessary 3-4 years ago than maybe it is today. I think if you dial back 3 to 5 years ago, there was very inconsistent flour supply in the States. So if you were a retail only operator, you really suffered from literally getting allocation of product and consistent supply of high quality flour in particular. And we thought that ultimately we wanted to have success as a house of brands and a retailer, and that was very difficult to do in many cases without controlling the quality and consistency of the genetics and the supply. And so we have stood up, like I said, cultivation and manufacturing operations in almost all of those states. We have our own portfolio of brands that we've launched with our flagship flour brand being Kind, which is a brand that has almost a 20-year legacy starting out in Reno, Nevada. So we have a brand that actually means something, and we're making sure that consumers across the country know what that stands for. And then across other categories, we're actually in the process of consolidating some of the brands and really putting all of our marketing efforts behind 4 major national brands that will span across categories. I think in hindsight, we'll probably all admit we probably made a little bit of a mistake by splintering brands into too narrow of product categories, where we had a brand for botanical vapes versus live resin vapes, et cetera, and it's really hard, to really build brands with a limited, marketing budget and some of the constraints that we all face, in this industry. So we're in process of doing that. We'll have most of that complete, through this year, and then we can talk about how we, partner with third-party brands as well.
Great. I mean, in 2018, or when you had the de-SPAC moment and you had your strategy moving forward, has the view of, okay, you've got the capacity expansion, utilization, that what has gone into the evolution? In the beginning, were you partnering with lots of brands, or just creating lots of your own brands versus kind of bringing in others, and how's that process evolved to 2023?
Sure. I mean, I think there's really two pieces when we talk about brand partnerships, right? There's, at retail, what brands are we carrying in our retail, dispensaries, where those brands are simply suppliers, right? And there's this constant debate within the industry on, vertical, integration and the benefit of, house brands versus third-party brands. What roles do those play? And there's slightly different dynamics by market. At one extreme, you have Florida, where you basically are only allowed to sell what you grow. So it's basically forced vertical integration. And you are allowed to partner with different third-party brands, but you have to produce them all yourself. Versus a market like Nevada, which is probably closer to California in some respects, and that there's dozens or 100 different brands to choose from that you can use to complement your own brands in the portfolio. I think as these markets all mature, and as consumers, increase their awareness and education of brands, I think there is going to be a constant, tension and need for consumer choice. So we all acknowledge, similar to, thinking about a liquor store. If you went into a liquor store and there was only 3 different kinds of vodka, even if one of them was the kind you wanted, it wouldn't appear to have the appropriate choice. And there's probably someone down the street that's going to offer a more robust opportunity for the consumers. So we do think in most, semi-mature markets, I think vertical integration probably shakes out at 30 to 50% or somewhere in that range in terms of what our own house brands as a percentage of sales can accommodate. It's probably a lower percentage of SKUs because our own, internal brands tend to skew a little higher in terms of productivity and the way that we can support them in our stores. But it still leaves a ton of shelf space for third-party brands. And some of those are national brands where you might see Wild or Kiva or Stizzy or Jeter, spanning into other markets that have had a lot of success across several markets. There's always great single state, brands, Fernway in Massachusetts, Timeless in Arizona, GLP or Nature's Chem in Nevada. So there's these great brands that have just created local trust and awareness within their respective, markets. There's typically MSOs, that are operating in different markets that have some of the shelf space. And then the rest of it are, independents. And, we have a particular focus on trying, to support and partner with social equity, brands to make sure that they have an adequate representation within our stores as well. So we think a balanced mix of kind of national brands, strong local brands, maybe boutique or artisanal, brands where we're, helping some of the local community members. We will have some MSO products, and then the balance, being the products that we offer in the respective state as well.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think what you're saying is that, obviously there are some brands emerging nationwide, and some of the gummy players, some of the vape players, harder to do with flower, but because you're vertically integrated, you have a less dependency to find strong flower brands. But when you're going into that partnership discussion, what are those, critical success factors, right? I mean, do you look at that and say, oh, you're not big enough to move the needle? But maybe that doesn't matter with the smaller brands in your local markets, or kind of give me that, like,
yeah. So I think as we start thinking about more strategic conversations, whether it's licensing, co-manufacturing, joint venture, acquisition, then the dynamics change a little bit because we get into those, we've talked about this in advance of this call, right? Some of the things that we will look at, and I think we can all admit is if we studied the industry over the last 5 or 10 years, let's be honest, there have been far more failures on brand partnerships and license agreements than successes, right? And so I've tried to be a student of the game. I live in California and sit on the board of a California company and have a nice strong lens of this market, but I work for an MSO, that's operating in some of the East Coast and Midwest states. So I'm definitely of the opinion that real brands matter, brands that have, a 10, 20-year legacy, that have authenticity, that have grassroots support, that play the game effectively with social media and creation of a lifestyle brand, not just a product. That being said, some of the things that flow through whether those are good fits for us. And I'll generalize with some of the other MSOs, they may have their own formula, but I think some of these things are reasonably consistent. One, I think it does need to be big enough to move the needle. These things take a ton of time. We're in process of, partnering with, a top 5 brand, in a state on the East Coast that will, announce reasonably soon. I can assure you, it takes dozens of C-suite and local senior team man hours to do this right. And we can't do 5 of these at a time across 5 states. And so if you're going to pick your lane, it needs to be worth, the opportunity cost, right? So we look for opportunities with brands that can really aid either our retail, experience. Maybe we have some type of exclusive or some benefit that drives traffic to our own retail, or if it's a wholesale opportunity where if it's a license agreement or co-manufacturing agreement, it needs to be accretive, to sort of the suitcase, if you will, of what the wholesale team has to sell. And we've seen that playbook done effectively, in craft beer and beverages, where you see Anheuser-Busch or Pepsi partner with a craft brewery or a kombucha drink or whatnot, where they can get the benefit of the distribution and the sales, channels. And it, we need to be able to have excess capacity, biomass manufacturing capacity to support the brands in a way that's accretive to our overall business. Yeah. So I would say that's, one piece. The second is operational complexity, right? There's some things that are easy to do, right? If it's, I don't know, a vape brand where you're basically just using their, terps, and you have, distant or live resin that you can add their secret sauce, put into hardware that you might already be using, that might be pretty easy to accommodate. If it's a solventless operator or a sophisticated gummy partner, there may be 7 figures of CapEx, building construction, changes in process, room for freezers. And so there's a lot of other things that you need to think about how easy it is to ultimately, produce the products. And we're very focused on also protecting their brands, right? We don't want to take someone on that's not going to be consistent with the quality and QC standards that they've developed for their brand. So we want this to be, successful. So I think those are at a high level some of the key things that I look for as we're, entering some of those conversations. And then on the market side, right, it's got to be a brand that, moves the needle. And so I look at things like market share in their home states, even if they haven't expanded into 5 markets where it's kind of easy to say, hey, the reality is something like Wild or Jeter or Stizzy, they're probably going to be successful in most markets they go, right? Then there's others where it's like, hey, they're really strong in California or Colorado. How do we figure out whether they're really going to be successful in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Florida or whatnot, right? We will do internal, market surveys on aided versus unaided brand awareness. Interestingly, some of these brands have a lot of brand equity even when they're not present, and others may have a great following in LA and no one's heard of them in these other markets. It doesn't mean they can't be successful. It just means that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, really in terms of brand activation. Social media following, is this truly a lifestyle brand? Does it have that following that is likely to transport into other markets? And then, we'll do reference checks with other partners in other states. Hey, how are these people to work with? These things don't go smoothly all the time. How do they, work with the ups and downs, of these relationships? How do they communicate? All those kind of softer things to make sure that we pick our spots and our people appropriately.
Yeah. So AYR has then, I think, as in, comparing you to other MSOs, it feels like you have embraced legacy brands more so than some of the other operators who have launched a number of, let's call them boardroom brands, right? I mean, has AYR launched any boardroom brands? Can brands be manufactured like that, or have you tried and determined that, the authenticity of the brand in Nevada, it's better to kind of work with them to bring them into our fold across all of our markets? Give a little view on like this boardroom brand concept.
Sure. I mean, look, I think transparently we've done some things well, and there's some things that, we've learned from that we're, making changes to do differently over time. As I mentioned, early on 2 or 3 years ago when we really launched a lot of our, brand portfolio, I think in hindsight, we made mistakes by being too narrow for some of the product categories. Most of those were boardroom brands that we, launched. I think as we look going forward, one of the key things that we're doing, like I mentioned, Kind has a tremendous, following on the West Coast. Is one of the, I think it's 1 or 2 in terms of BDS rankings of flower brands in Nevada. And they used to actually be more active in other categories outside of flower. We're going to double down, with Kind both in Nevada and nationally. But instead of just being a flower brand, it's going to be a vape brand, a tincture brand, potentially an edible brand, concentrates, pre-rolls. So there's no reason that we wouldn't really leverage that brand equity, put additional marketing dollars, and to basically, leverage the authenticity that they built, which is very, very difficult to replicate with a great made up, brand as great as the marketing agency, may be. Now, there still may be opportunities, let's say, for a solventless brand, which, there are a couple that have existed here for a bit, but it's a newer category. So there may be, parts of the market where newer brands, can exist as people start thinking about splintering, the price architecture of value brands. I think that's an appropriate place where, maybe I'll call them a boardroom brand makes sense, because the reality is that the message of that brand really is reasonable, quality for great value. And so having the who's who of California brands may not be the most important thing to get to that consumer segment. So I think it's kind of a portfolio is the way that I, look at it. But going back to your point, it's very, very difficult, to create a new brand that's going to compete in the hearts and minds of consumers the way that, Alien Labs or Connected or Cookies or Jeter or Stizzy, right? Those things are real brands that have a lot of following and a lot of brand equity. And so when I hear, over time, there are certain operators that I think have felt like they're always doing those brands a favor to let them into, let's say a limited license state. I think it's inevitable. It's going to happen. We're either going to be a partner or part of it, or a vendor to them on retail. But I think we have probably more of an open mind towards, where the brand architecture and category management of these markets is going to be, and we don't overstay our welcome on sometimes the benefits of a narrow, supply demand, market, because we've all seen those things get efficient pretty quickly. Massachusetts went from a pretty tight supply demand market in 2017, 18, 19 to, like, quite frankly, massively oversupplied last year. And then you had almost like the wipeout event, and now it's, kind of getting back into equilibrium. So I think all these things are going to be an evolution, but they'll open up over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think what with the discussion that the industry was having, I think it's, even in 2022, but certainly in 2021, is there are no brands in cannabis. It's too early. I don't hear anyone talking about that anymore. I think it's pretty clear that there are some, probably 5 to 7 players that have reached a level of scale that is very impressive. So there is a bifurcation of the big ones that almost you need to, if you don't have Wild or Kiva or, a well-known national gummy brand on your shelves, right? And then you've talked about where you guys can be the low end. You can have a house brand that is maybe, lower cost gummy under an AYR brand. But when you look at those partnerships, do you also take into consideration not just the brand itself, but the product market fit? Like, where does it fit in the pricing structure in your portfolio to make sure that, okay, we have, it's whether it's gold, silver, bronze, or, what have you, do you spend a lot of time figuring out where do the products fit within the portfolio, and therefore go out and source a brand that is a perfect match for that middle tier price point? Or is that something that says, gosh, this is white space in all of our markets, why don't we launch a brand here?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're obviously looking at that for our own, brand portfolios to figure out where there are holes in the market, either on our shelves or on the shelves of our third-party wholesale customers. But exactly what you're saying in terms of, partnership with, third-party brands, particularly again going back to the licensing, co-manufacturing, side of things. We do look at that. How is that complementary with our own portfolio, in a particular state that we're talking about partnering with? Obviously, some of these can turn into multi-state, deals as well. I would say, generally speaking, maybe with the exception of Old Pal, who's had a fair amount of success on the value side, it seems like most of the more successful opportunities are on the kind of premium or mass premium side of things. I think the MSOs can probably get to the value side of most of these categories with their own house brands. It's really the unlock of what really drives traffic, what are consumers seeking out, and those are generally the brands that I'm looking to partner with. So I agree with you, there's not that much debate of the people that are probably intellectually honest that brands are starting to matter, but there's a massive bifurcation. I can't almost overestimate that enough. I think we could all rip off 10 names and there's probably reasonable consensus like, yeah, those brands mean something. Most of them have had success in, multiple markets and probably are likely to have more success than not as they enter additional markets. I think there's obviously, boutique brands that maybe aren't huge, but there's a lot of respect for in the market, with 710 Labs or some other people that aren't huge businesses, but people are like, yeah, that's, great. And when they enter a new market, there'll be consumers lining up, for those products. But as we know, and having spent a lot of time at Hall Flowers the last 5-6 years, there's 500, 800 California brands. And if there's one mistake that I see talking to a lot of, brands is some of those folks that have $1 million or $2 million brand in California thinking that it's going to be so easy to have a tremendous amount of success in other markets just because they were born, here and maybe have had some modest level of success. I think that's where there's probably the biggest disconnect in opinion between like the MSO leaders and some of the strong entrepreneurs is how important those brands are to a much bigger, enterprise. Again, what's going to move the needle and who's building whose brand, right? Because if we're going to be doing so much work to build the brand equity of this brand and bring them into New Jersey or Massachusetts or whatnot, it's a relationship where things need to be mutually beneficial. And sometimes the mindset of the entrepreneurs is not, quite there. I think they think they're bringing a lot to the table. And again, sometimes that is the case. But I think you have to be honest with yourselves of like, hey, you're either in that top 10 or 15, or you have to be doing something really special to really be able to make your mark and have a high probability of success in these other markets.
I mean, would you go so far as to say to a brand, I do like your brand. I'm not so sure it's going to move the needle, but I think it's a good fit for our market. If you can find another co-manufacturer to make it, we'll put it on your shelf, but we don't really want to touch this one from a manufacturing perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I've had plenty of those conversations. I mean, obviously it's a much lower commitment to carry a brand on our shelves, right? And those aren't permanent relationships. So you can take on a new product, see how it works. If it's unsuccessful, you haven't bet the farm and you move on. And if it is successful, you continue supporting them. But it's really, hey, if we're gonna have to invest, capital and hundreds of hours of management time and everything else, we're not gonna do that for a $1 million revenue opportunity given the size and scale of our business. It really needs to be something that moves the needle and fits into those buckets of really driving opportunity into our own, stores on the retail side, aka Florida, right? You partner with one of the best brands. You're the only game in town and in the whole state of where consumers can find that brand. And I do think that's a traffic driving strategy. On the wholesale side, we have good distribution in terms of what percentage of dispensaries we serve in many of our markets. And so having another product that we think we can, push through the pipes and has sell-through and velocity at those third-party retailers, that's good for the partner brand, it's good for us, and it's good for those retailers. And so those are the things that, might make more sense for us to have a strategic partnership with.
Yeah. So let's drill down a little bit into that engagement with the brand. It lands in your inbox. You meet them at Hall Flowers. It's a mid-tier California brand, pretty dominant in a specific category. So we're not talking about the Jeters and the Stizzies and the Wilds right now. What is that what is your initial due diligence on them, and how does that evolve in terms of like, okay, it's a crazy market right now, and I can't enter into agreements with companies that aren't financially sound and solid, so I need to see some balance sheets from you. I mean, what are the first like gates that a brand needs to get through to be considered with you, and where do you kind of, when do you cut to the chase, right? Like, bottom line, this, are you going to be sustainable and I need to see your balance sheet? Or where are those, like, I don't want to waste a lot of time, push points in those initial discussions?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things that I look for out of the gates. I look for, distribution, doors in their home market. So maybe that's California or Colorado or whatever market they were kind of born in. The distribution sales growth and the retention of those accounts they started with, and probably most important, sales velocity, right? There's some people that game the system. I'm in 400 doors and you sell, $500 per account, and it doesn't add up too much. So looking for signs that even if they're not a huge brand today, that the retail brands, the retail chains that they're partnering, with are having success selling that brand, and is a signal that consumers, have sort of pull demand, as opposed to just having success on the sell-in side of things. I'll go and look at their social media accounts. How many people follow them on Instagram or Twitter or whatnot? What is the growth and trajectory of those follower accounts? And then obviously, living here, I have a network of folks that I'll check. Hey, what is this product good? Have you tried it? I'll try it. I'm a consumer. I'm not the expert in everything, but I think I have enough people I can rely on to say, hey, is this really good, average, or crap, right? So like that's another filter, as well. So assuming it passes that, I would say certainly in the last couple of years, given the challenges in the capital markets and funding, it's probably something I wasn't as early in my gate process 5 years ago, but it's like, hey, if we're thinking about partnering or licensing, one of the things that we're almost insistent on is that the brands are in charge of the local market brand activation. There's a lot of different models and tactics and strategies on how to get there, but let's be honest, MSOs do an average job at best on activating their own brands in their own states. And so to do that on behalf of someone else is basically impossible and probably set up to fail. So generally speaking, I've preferred to pay a slightly higher royalty rate, but push the brand building exercise back at the brands, which is what they're good at. That's what brands do. And so, but that requires commitment from them and the ability to have a sustainably funded business to be able to invest in people and marketing spend, et cetera. And oftentimes that's not necessarily free cash flow positive immediately out of the gate. There's an investment period for them as well. And so making sure that those brands are consistent and can continue to invest, so that we have that support for the brand. And if you put those two things together of good product market fit, good brand equity, and a sustainably funded brand, with a company and operations and products that we can produce and have the infrastructure to do, you're probably set up to have a reasonable shot of success.
Yeah. So if I came to you with a brand that was, had a lot of those box checked, and you said, okay, there's a real potential here, is the onus on you to take a first shot at a business model, a business plan for what this partnership can generate, and then present that to the brand and saying, this is what we think we can do in this market with you? Or are you looking for them to contribute to that process? Because nobody knows Florida as well as you do. Well, Florida wasn't a great example, but Massachusetts. I mean, where does that alignment come to be like, okay, this is what we're actually going to do. This is what we think we can do. And in order to do that, you're going to have to do all that activation stuff. We'll dig into that a little bit more in a second. But at what point are you developing the go forward plan and like, okay, this is what we think we do? Are you still interested? Because this is a lot of work.
Yeah, I would say it's certainly helpful if the brands have taken a crack at that, before we get too far down the process. Once you get deeply engaged, it does tend to become a very mutual, process. And we're going through that, like I said, right now with another brand where we're sharing, models and sending files back and forth of, hey, here's our, sales, per dispensary, edibles or vapes is generally this percentage of the category. Here's where we are today. If you enter, the mix here, what's going to be cannibalistic growth versus what's, accretive growth? What type of market share have we seen in other, markets, right? And so a lot of times we are looking somewhat at case studies of other markets, but particularly for a brand that has experience in other markets, or is even trying to model out for themselves. If you have seen 40% or 50%, penetration by doors and average accounts by $10,000, a month, and there's 200 dispensaries, right? You can start there with, a very simple, model laying out the gross revenue opportunity. We can look quickly at the unit economics of producing the product, so we can look at the revenue pool and sort of the profit pool. And at least as a starting point, we can say that's really off, or that's probably pretty close. And how do we chop things up? Whether it's a straight revenue royalty deal, whether there's a more convoluted formula, and then who's responsible for what, expenses. And then, we'll kind of look at what we think the economics are on both sides and make sure that that's a reasonable split. But there's a lot of people that spend a lot of time focused on what's the royalty rate. The more important thing is what's the size of the pie that's being divided up. Partnerships don't go bad because royalties were off by a point or two if there's a lot of revenue. They generally don't work because it doesn't turn into a revenue pie that excites either side. Yeah. So that stuff all matters as you get through the details, don't get me wrong. But the key thing is to find mutually beneficial opportunities that are going to drive millions of dollars of revenue. And then those things generally work out, reasonably well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's back to the move the needle. And I think a lot of people are kind of obsessed on like, well, what's my percent? What's my percent? And the question is, what are you investing in the market? I mean, I would imagine you have obviously all over the map in terms of the funding capability of your partners. Some don't have, more than, just, please sell my product and do the best you can and send me the mailbox check. Probably don't have many of those deals left. But others are saying, I'm prepared to invest. But at the end of the day, I mean, investing in marketing, you don't seem to be asking for a significant investment in sales. But if the brand is more aggressive and has the capital to do more marketing, is it perfectly reasonable, and have you done deals where it's like, okay, you're absolutely in the much higher, I'm not going to even put the number, but the much higher position in terms of royalty rate that you can garner. If you're going to put that kind of marketing budget into this thing, that's fantastic. You deserve more. Is that, how do you
look,
play?
These things can take all different shapes and forms, and we've seen successes and failures of all these things. I generally think, for us, we have pretty good sales in most of the states. So that may be different if you're partnering with someone that has maybe a great cultivation or manufacturing facility, but not a big wholesale sales team, or they're not fully penetrated with their own brands or other partner brands in 75% of the dispensaries. Then it might make sense for the brand to take on sales. But then you also might want to ask yourself, hey, do I have the right partner? Because what am I getting? Or maybe this should just be a straight co-manufacturing deal. I'll give them a 20% margin or markup for producing the product, but that's a much lower margin business than someone licensing, where they're taking the startup, the working capital, and all the other risks associated with the P&L of that relationship. And again, on the marketing side, it's not so much we're asking brands to go massively out of pocket, but it might be, let's say there's a royalty rate of, 10%, 15% of wholesale sales. We may say, hey, we want to see a minimum of 50% reinvestment, of those royalties back into the business. And you're responsible for pop-ups, social media support, outside, the festivals and, all the other things kind of outside of the dispensary. So more of the brand ambassador, brand activation side of things. They may have one, person that goes around and meets, with buyers either in conjunction or separately from our wholesale team as like the new account, rep. But our team would be fully generally responsible for sales, fulfillment, delivery, and and those types of things. Generally, as the licensed operator, it makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that kind of segues us to a little bit about this kind of concept of brand activation. In your experience, what is absolutely mission critical, like table stakes? You can't, if you're coming into a market, you must do what?
So I think it's not, it's very similar whether it's a partnership or own brands. Obviously, we know consumer and bud tender education is, paramount, right? So there's a number of ways to get there. Sampling. By the way, that's not cheap, that's not inexpensive, right? But super important. Getting the product into the hands of the buyers, bud tenders, assistant store managers, and where applicable, depends on state laws of how to get, cheap trial sample discounted product in the hand of, consumers. Sometimes that might be through uninfused product, for gummies so they can just taste the flavors. There are times where you have the ability to run, specials or whatnot to make sure that people have a reasonably low barrier to entry experience the first time they're trialing a product, because the initial trial is oftentimes the hardest. If someone tries a vape or flower or edibles and they like it, getting that second purchase is a lot easier than the first one. But if they see a $60 eighth they've never had and they're not sure if it's good, and a bud tender's not raving about it, it's probably not going to have the highest velocity in the world. So you really need the combination of support direct to consumer, and then, quite honestly, I think you get more bang for your buck on the channel, training, right? The bud tender and store manager education and training. So that requires, some combination of virtual, training, feet in the street doing patient education days, brand ambassador days, and bud tender training, right? And that may be a couple hundred dispensaries that you have to hit one by one, 2 hours at a time, spread across a state that may be 8 hours, apart, right? It's tedious. Lining people up, nailing them down for times, getting windows where they're open, right? It's all those things are in the weeds, but it's a bigger challenge than people think. People are like, okay, great, I'm gonna go do bud tender education. And it's like actually literally just scheduling and getting the forum and the quorum, with these people, and then finding a way to make those events impactful, right? Both, again, in and outside of the dispensary. Are the brands showing up, to the music festivals? Are they doing the cool, events outside of the dispensaries to be part of the community and create that lifestyle, aspect in combination with what's going on, in the licensed dispensaries?
Yeah, no, those aren't trivial expenses for a medium-sized brand. I mean, a feet on the street right there, you're talking about, probably a full-time resource
That's right.
Is at a minimum. And
Right.
then you add in all the other things you're looking at, reinvesting first year's royalty checks, sometimes will still come up a little short from what that investment looks
Right.
like.
I mean, think about it, as I said, like, it's not super, super easy to build $1 million, brand very, very quickly. Some do it, but right, let's say $1 million times 10%, which is sort of probably an average royalty. There's obviously things higher or lower. It's only 100 grand, right? And then if you have to have a full-time person in market, never mind the corporate allocation to that, it's not the immediate path to success. You ultimately need a path towards pushing that to a $5 or $10 million brand, doing it across a few different states, and then you may have something that creates a lot of enterprise value for the brand, itself. But it's the reason that if we don't think this can be a multi-million-dollar brand, we know there's not enough dollars going back to the brand partner. It's going to be a distraction for us. It's not going to be that profitable for them, and we're probably not going to get the reinvestment that, ultimately is going to generate the top line results that we're looking for. And a lot of these things just kind of peter out. Yeah. And we've, I think, had a pretty tight filter for the brand partnerships that we're doing going forward. But through the M&A that we've done, we've definitely inherited, a number of different licensing deals over the years. And I would say most of them probably didn't have those appropriate filters. Some were hey, we'll just stick, a product in a different bag, charge a markup and see if it works. And the answer is not usually. And, two, some of them were with brands that don't necessarily have a tremendous amount of brand equity. And so they weren't selling for a premium to our own products. And so then we're paying a royalty for something with a lower realized price and ultimately a higher cost. And so it's not really doing anything for us, and it's just lower margin product.
Right.
And so oftentimes those things don't have a life, that generally extends too far beyond the contractual obligations that we inherited.
Listening to you talk, I mean, both you and I have done a lot of M&A, and there's the old adage in M&A is it takes just as much time to do a $5 million acquisition as a $50 million acquisition, or pick your number. It sounds, listening to you, it sounds like that actually translates right over to brand expansion partnership. I mean, it doesn't matter how big you are. These things take time and energy and effort and resources from both parties to make right. And even when you try everything to do it perfectly and best practices, things can still go wrong.
Correct.
What would be an example, or not necessarily naming companies, but what has gone wrong? Maybe an AYR initiative that didn't work out as planned versus the company being at fault. Like what has gone wrong? What are some of those where the tentacles stand up?
Yeah, so I would say, let's see, again, some of those licensed brands that we inherited, we probably didn't move quick enough to figure out an approach with the brands, whether it was our effort or their effort, that was going to change the inflection of the business.
Right.
A lot of those were, I would call, more passive, kind of Gen 1 licensing deals, where it's like, hey, you sell my stuff in that market and just kind of hope it works, and the brands just sort of get a royalty, probably for not doing that much. So maybe for them it was, hey, as long as you sell something, I get a check, and it's all, good.
Right.
And so I think some of those things, didn't catalyze their own success, and maybe we could have done more, early on to change the trajectory, of those. We did acquire the leading beverage business in Massachusetts called Levia. Levia, at the time, had 50 or 75% market share, partially because there weren't that many other beverages. It is a great product. But when we acquired it, which is the only brand that we've really acquired since the initial portfolio of acquisitions, I think we expected to launch that in additional states a lot faster than we ultimately have. We have launched the non-beverage parts of the business, like the water-soluble, drink drops, et cetera. That's a little easier to launch in markets. But canning lines are extremely expensive to set up, and the reliability of third-party co-packers is generally tricky, limited in capacity. Sometimes the costs don't make sense. Sometimes, the operational integrity of those businesses, it doesn't line up with how we're trying to build our business. And so I think we expected that to go faster than it has. We're moving, probably pivoting a little bit more towards an asset-light model where we're partnering, because I think for all the beverages, it's not a very big piece of the market today. I think generally a lot of us believe it'll be bigger over time, but the capacity utilization of building a $3 or $5 million bottling line, it almost doesn't make sense unless you team up with other beverage brands. So we're in conversations as we speak with groups where it may take the form of kind of co-manufacturing, where we're actually not doing some of the sales and marketing and distribution, because some of them may be competitors, but they're going to come to the market one way or another. So it's probably beneficial for the category to drive costs down, because I think the revenue opportunity would increase across beverages if the price point were closer to $4 or $5 than $7 or $8. But to do that, you need to have a more efficient manufacturing process. So that's one that probably hasn't gone exactly according to the original, thesis. But I think we also have a revised playbook that will make it more sustainable. And I think it's very, very early in the life cycle of beverages, so I don't think we've necessarily lost the opportunity by any means.
Right. So let's pivot a little bit. I talk to a lot of brands that say we want to expand into new markets, and I say, okay, well, why don't we talk to the MSOs? You want to talk to the MSOs, and there's a fair percentage of those brands that say, no way, these guys are going to steal my IP. I'm going to teach them everything I know, and then they're going to just take it and run with it. How do you respond to somebody that seems to think that MSOs are really actively looking to, take and run with your IP as a reason not to do business with an MSO.
Yeah, look, I guess that probably the same argument or the same concern would be applicable to almost any industry, right? Whether it's pharmaceutical, whether it's, I mean, dog food, like anytime you're partnering with a co-packer or a licensed partner that's also engaging either with their own brands or other competitive brands, you naturally have some of these concerns, right? So look, there's obviously some protections and IP protections and intellectual property written into the contract, right? So there are some contractual protections.
Yeah.
But two, it's like, who are the people? What's their track, record been in other situations? Do your reference checks, whether it's an MSO or otherwise, on the partners themselves. How do they act in these types of situations? The third thing is, which is also part of the reality, is there's not that much intellectual property, really across a lot of these different products. Obviously, everyone has their, special sauce to a certain degree. But if you think of what a brand is, it's generally far more than just the product formulation itself. Wild isn't wild because they produce some gummy that no one else could ever emulate, right? They have a very high quality gummy. They have really cool packaging. They've done a great job on, lifestyle and branding and brand activation. The pricing is reasonably competitive, right? Those are really the things that create brand equity over time that are sustainable, unless it's really more of a science or biotech, driven, piece. I would say 80% of the brand equity in this industry is not driven solely by the IP. It's all those other intangibles. So you want to protect yourself, the best way possible. But if you're not expanding because you're solely concerned about the IP, that's probably not like 1, 2, or 3, on the most important things that ultimately matter, at least in my mind. And I think if you find the right partner, you should be able to, manage your concerns appropriately.
Yeah, makes sense. Now let's talk about the other scenario where, real briefly here, that you also partner with other MSOs. How is it different to partner with an MSO versus a brand, and what goes into those considerations? Because it seems like that might be more of a business relationship in some markets than necessarily the other MSO's brand is going to win with that authenticity discussion that how do you look at that, and is that just kind of a necessary part of your business?
Well, look, I think the reality is in many of the more limited licensed markets, right? The Illinois, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, maybe Ohio to a lesser extent, Massachusetts early on, the MSOs either through new market application, M&A, or by virtue of having capital to build out facilities, a lot of them were the most meaningful brands in a lot of these markets. And brands may be a strong word. Maybe they just had supply and had product on these markets, and therefore gained some amount of brand equity and awareness because they've been there. And so oftentimes, MSOs may represent, 30 to 50% of the available supply in a given market. And so naturally, as a dispensary operator, you're very likely to carry some of those brands, on your shelves. And they oftentimes have dispensaries themselves. And so we obviously are selling into those MSOs. And so, I have pretty good relationships, with the senior folks at most of the other MSOs, and most of them we have pretty productive commercial, agreements, whether it's buying or selling in various markets. I think, and that's always been the case really the last, several years. I think you're starting to see a few more interesting conversations, again, both MSOs and strong single state operators, on how we can all leverage each other's infrastructure in a more mutually beneficial way. There may be some markets like in Massachusetts, we have a massive state-of-the-art, beautiful cultivation facility that could supply, a reasonable sized chunk of the market. We have not planted nearly all of that facility because we're a little worried about supply demand. That's getting better. but we can produce higher quality cannabis at a lower price than I'm sure many of the indoor operators there. And so we're starting to have conversations with some of the guys that maybe had 10, 20, 30,000 square foot of canopy saying, hey, look, my cost to grow a pound is probably $1,000. If I can give that weight and you guys can co-pack for me on a consistent basis and produce quality that's as good or better, and maybe I can do something where my costs aren't dramatically lower, but I don't have to deal with the headaches and the growing pains and everything else. If they can just source it, from us at a small premium and not have to have, all that infrastructure, there's a lot of folks that are having those conversations about whether that makes sense.
Yeah.
Similar to what I discussed on co-packing for beverages, like those conversations weren't happening 2 or 3 years ago. It's really as capital's gotten a little tighter, as everyone's really been focused more inward on their own businesses, trying to drive efficiency, manage working capital, manage costs. I think there's a lot more discussions around, are there win-wins out there? And again, it's not at all limited to MSOs. It's, if we went vertical in Illinois, previously the only way to do that was to go buy a license, which would have cost tens of millions of dollars,
Right.
then tens of millions of dollars to build it out. Yeah, there are some craft, licenses that have been issued, but it might be, hey, we go talk to a single state operator and see if we can basically get 20,000 or 10,000 square feet of canopy inside their 100,000 facility with our genetics, and they basically do the work. They make a return, on that, and we get a discount to wholesale pricing, and it's kind of a win-win if they had some excess capacity that they otherwise, weren't using. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting conversations that play out given the state of the industry today.
Creativity rules the day. We have 5 minutes. We're going to go to a couple of questions that we have here. So I'm going to ask a question. This one's from Tom Rimbach. How does a high-performing edible brand in a single state that doesn't have a license play in the realm of reciprocity? If we don't have a license, but our product is a high performer, what else can we do? And what do you see as the future for brands not associated with MSOs?
Yeah, look, I think some of the reciprocity stuff has been a little bit overstated. I mean, if I look at markets, where brands, don't have any retail, so they kind of don't have anything to offer a buyer or retail chain outside of the fact that it's a good brand and consumers want it. They still have a lot of shelf space, and very few of them that are driving sell-through and velocity, I think are seeing their business shrink because they don't have the shelf space to offer. I think sometimes that can be a crutch. I think, sometimes if you have an average product, that can be a little bit of an assist. But I think there's always still room for products that drive sell-through and velocity. And when you can have a data-driven approach, to a buyer or a chain, very few people are going to turn you down if they think it's going to be accretive to their retail. The second piece is margins, right? I think generally speaking, sophisticated retailers expect to earn a 50% plus realized margin net of discounts, all that stuff, right? And so part of it is working with those partners to make sure that they can get that. And it could be working with them on effective promotional campaigns that are more effective than what they might be doing on their own. It could be working on your own cost structure so that you can lower your costs, so you can lower your cost to them. It could be focused on consumer and bud tenders and making people want to buy that product without having to put it on sale, because a lot of these markets sell a lot of things on promotion, and the natural velocity of things at full price, unfortunately, in this current market environment, oftentimes don't move as much. So it's really thinking through effective co-promotional plans with your key retail accounts to have share of voice and to be relevant in the respective shops.
Jaime, there's a couple questions from people that are asking, like, at what point are we relevant enough to you to continue to have a discussion about representing my brand? We had one, would you do a partnership with a pre-revenue brand, or how much revenue do I need to be relevant to you? Shed a little bit of light, and maybe, if there are areas. I mean, maybe niche little small brands with a great story, you know, or social equity, what have you. Share like, you know, how do the little guys get on your radar and be relevant?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are probably more exceptions than the rules, but like in New Jersey, we are launching and collaborating with basically a pre-revenue brand called Mud Brothers, where we're going to do a solventless, you know, launch in New Jersey. You know, great people. We've kind of, you know, met them coming up through the, you know, social equity, you know, programs, and you know, I think it's a little bit of a focus for, you know, a lot of the MSOs. I think we've all seen there's the box checkers, and then there's the people where it's like truly part of their culture and DNA. I've really wanted to focus on, you know, restorative justice and reinvestment in the communities, and truly enabling and partnering from a business entrepreneurial, you know, perspective to support those brands. So that's certainly something where on the margin, you know, there's more leeway. We don't give anyone a free pass, right? But our filters are a little bit broader, you know, there, because it's a key element of our, you know, culture and our DNA that we want to give back. But the reality is, you know, pre-revenue, you know, brands are tough, right? Because we carry a lot of risk, right? If we signed a licensing agreement, we have to go buy packaging, build up a ton of working capital. If it works, they get a royalty check. If it doesn't, we get left holding the bag, right? And we're all very sensitive to, you know, cash and cash flow, return on capital, all these, you know, traditional financial metrics that have a lot of, you know, focus from investors and board and C-suites, et cetera, in a way that is more intense than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. So it's sort of more challenging to like swing the bat with a wide range of outcomes. So maybe there's ways you can skin the cat. If it's a co-manufacturing agreement where that same brand, you know, takes the risk on sales and working capital, right? It puts a little more risk in their camp, but you're probably likely to find a broader range of groups that will consider that, because there's not as much downside, you know, to someone like ourselves. So, you know, there's different ways that you might be able to get there, but I think generally speaking, not to discourage folks, it's challenging for the large operators, you know, to partner and have to take a lot of risk on a brand that probably, even if it works, you know, isn't necessarily going to be huge unless you strike lightning in a bottle, which can happen, but again, lower likelihood. And where you have to build up a lot of front-end investment and spend a lot of time for something with a lower probability of a big reward. So that means, you know, fight and shoot, you know, be able to point to a market, you know, where you've grown, right? If you're a California brand, you know, go win in one other state, right? And then you have something you can point to and say, hey, we crushed it in LA. I know we weren't the biggest California brand. The retail's a mess, but look at our sell-through in these 40 great accounts in Southern California. We then went to Michigan or Colorado, and, you know, we made a mark in a pretty competitive, you know, fragmented market. Then it's not such a big leap of faith to launch in New Jersey or Florida or Massachusetts, right? So that would be my best advice, is to win once or twice, and then it really opens up your opportunities.
Entrepreneurial grit will be rewarded. Awesome. We are wrapped up. It's been a quick hour. Jaime, Mendola, AYR Wellness, thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to also thank Paybotic for sponsoring this webinar. And don't forget, 3 weeks from today, we are back with Cam Clark, CEO of Sunderstorm, the maker of the Kana gummies, who not only is expanding into the US, but is going to Thailand. So come back and join us in a couple of weeks for that. Jaime, thanks so much for being with us, and we look forward to tracking your progress working with brands for years to come. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Erik. Appreciate it.
All right. Good stuff. Bye-bye.